with the team to help out the Christian Union and Events Week, so it's really great to be here in Glasgow. I've never been here before, so yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Tom, what did you study at university?
I studied history at university, which hence why I'm giving this talk on the historical reliability of the Bible. I really love doing history, it's a passion of mine. I'm sure it's not the same for everybody, so I'm going to try and make this as interesting as possible for the rest of you too. Cool, brilliant, thank you very much. I'm just going to move my thing around a bit so I can reach it from this side of the projector. So today we're looking at this question: outdated, corrupted and unreliable. What kind of God would hide in an ancient book? This question of the historical reliability, the trustworthiness of the Bible is a really important one. It's a really foundational question, especially this week. If you've had a chance to look at any of the flyers for the Events Week that's run by the Christian Union, you'll see that all sorts of questions and objections are going to be dealt with and answered over the course of these lunchtime events. And as we do that, as we address those questions, we're going to be doing it by looking at the person of Jesus, and particularly how Jesus is represented through the accounts of his life as found in the Bible. So if you can't trust the Bible historically, if you can't trust it that it's a reliable source, then it's very difficult to trust that Jesus is trustworthy either, and that any of the answers we put to the questions this week totally mean nothing. So we really want to address this question of the historical reliability of the Bible in a way that's helpful, and in a way that will help you to see that some of the issues that are going to be raised later on in the week are helpful for you too. And now the Bible, I think, is a book that is so hugely controversial in many parts of the world, and maybe for many people as well. I think the Bible, in many ways, is a bit like the Twilight Saga by Stephanie Meyer, in that it attracts an awful lot of criticism and hatred from all sorts of people, often by people who've never really read it. But unlike the Twilight Saga, I think some of the criticisms that are put towards the Bible are largely unjustified. And we can argue that they don't stand up to criticism. People like Christopher Hitchens, the famous atheist, make very bold quotes about the Bible. He said this: "The case for biblical consistency or authenticity or inspiration has been in tatters for some time, and the rents and tears only become more obvious with better research, and thus no revelation can be derived from that quarter." Christopher Hitchens, he doesn't place an awful lot of importance on the Bible. But as I said before, I am a historian. I've got a lot of experience in analysing historical texts and showing that they can be proved to be trustworthy. And I'm also a Christian. So looking at the historical reliability of the Bible is something I'm really passionate about. So over the next few minutes, we're going to be examining this question: is the Bible corrupt and outdated and unreliable? And we're going to be doing it as a historian would, by asking 5 key questions that historians must ask of every source. We're going to be asking what, who, when, where, and why. What, who, when, where, why. These are the kind of questions that we have to ask of any historical source if we want to take it seriously. But historians are not the only people who have questions about the Bible. Maybe you're here today and you've got questions or objections about the Bible. Has it been changed over time? Is the story itself true and reliable? Well, we're going to be looking at those questions too, and I hope demonstrating that a historical discipline and a historical approach to the Bible can answer those questions as well. Before we start, I want to make a quick caveat that this is a complex and layered argument. I'm not seeking to provide conclusive proof, but just to begin to express some ideas and get you thinking that maybe the Bible is more trustworthy than we would give it credit for. Often people's first objection to the historical reliability of the Bible would stop us from analysing it before we even get started. They might say, why should I even bother investigating? The Bible, it talks about miracles as if they are fact. It's obviously a religious book. Why on earth would you want to approach that historically? How can you do that? Well, the first question we're going to look at is the what question, the what historical question. And hopefully that will demonstrate why it's worth studying the Bible historically. So I've got to keep reaching over. Firstly, we've got to ask, is the Bible a historical narrative, or is it just a religious myth? Maybe as you read the Bible or hear about Jesus, you can't help but think that it sounds a bit like a religious fairy tale. There's full of people performing miraculous feats like miracles. There's stories of angels and demons, ghostly reappearances after death and things like that. A story perhaps with some interesting moral lessons, but not to be taken literally. Is that the kind of text the Bible is? Well, it's important to recognise that the Bible isn't written in the language of historical or religious myth. Myths are particularly unique, aren't they, in the way that we approach them. A myth might begin like this. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, not situated in any real place historically or any real historical time, totally unverifiable. Nobody tells you where Prince Charming was Prince of, so you can never check out the reliability of that story. But that's not how the Gospel starts at all. In front of you, you should have books called Uncover, and these are source documents about the life of Jesus written by a guy called Luke. And Luke begins part of the adult part of the account of Jesus' life, not once upon a time in a land far, far away, but situated in a real historical place and a real historical time, in the time of Tiberius Caesar in the land of Judea. And not only that, but he also mentions 8 different historical figures as you go through. Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod, some local leaders, some high priests, and the famous John the Baptist. And these people can all be verified as living, as real historical people at the time that Luke puts them to. Everything from coins to inscriptions, archaeological digs, even human remains point to the fact that these people are real. We know that they existed, and that they existed at the time and place that Luke puts them in. Well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because the Bible is not just a religious book, but a book that's rooted in real, verifiable history. It's possible for a book to be religious and factual. So what Luke's doing by laying out all these people is inviting scrutiny. He's inviting people to come and say, is this true? That's not what you get in a religious myth. The American scholar George Eldon Ladd summarised the significance of this by saying, the uniqueness and scandal of the Christian religion rests on mediation of revelation through historical events. And if those facts should be disproved, Christianity would be false. And then he goes on to say that this, however, is what makes Christianity unique, because unlike other world religions, modern man has a means of actually verifying Christianity's truth by historical evidence. So we should not just dismiss the Bible as a religious myth, but approach it historically and see whether the facts stand up to scrutiny. So as we carry on looking at the historical reliability of the Bible, often the first objection that many people have is the corruption of the text. The idea that the Bible has been changed and corrupted over time. And that's implicit, isn't it, in the title of today's talk. Many people assume that the story of Jesus was written down many, many hundreds of years after he lived, have been copied from one another throughout the centuries, so that we can barely be sure that what we have today looks anything like what was written 2,000 years ago. Surely the text has been corrupted, people say. Yesterday's talk, if you were here, when we were looking at Is God an Illusion, we heard from Darren Brown. Well, we didn't have to hear from Darren Brown, we heard from Darren Brown, but he wasn't really here. Although he could have been and just did some kind of magic to make me forget it. But he says in his book, Tricks of the Mind, that the evidence shows very clearly that the stories of the New Testament were written in the first couple of 100 years after the historical Jesus died. These stories then continued to be edited and revised for political and social needs for most of the first millennium. These are the kind of attitudes that people have to the Bible, corrupted over time. So to address this, we need to ask our second historical question. We've looked at the what, we need to ask when. When were the texts actually written? And when do the copies that we have today date from? Well, the evidence suggests that the claims of people like Darren Brown and other atheists like him are not as well founded as you might think. References to the Gospels from other people in history alone suggest that they must have been written before the end of the 1st century AD, which is about a generation or so after Jesus died. Now that's hardly the centuries and centuries we assume, is it? And that's really important, because many people say that legends and the deity of Jesus developed long after he was really around. The historical Jesus was something very different. But if the texts were written within one generation, that's not enough time for a legend to develop. Myths take a long, long time to come about. I think it suggests that it's not likely that the stories would have been changed, since they were already circulating and widely read, while the eyewitnesses who contributed to the stories would still be alive to refute it. The texts have not been corrupted. Further evidence points to this too. Historians who are examining the reliability of the Bible have 24,000 copies of the texts in other ancient languages. I don't know what's happened to the rest of the slide there, I'll just have to read it out. They have 24,000 texts, each of which point to the recent writing of the Gospels. So 9,000 of them are in Greek, 15,000 in other ancient languages. And they were, the earliest of which was copied 40 to 70 years after the originals were written. So when you have a Bible today, you're not relying on texts that have been passed down and down through the generations and changed and corrupted by scholars and copyists, but copies very, very close to the original in just 40 years or so. So the objection that the texts have been changed over a long period of time, that doesn't seem to hold much water either. Those when historical questions give us good reason to suggest that the texts haven't been corrupted and changed over time. But a further question that remains then must be surely this: how can what has been recorded be true? If the texts haven't changed over time, were the original stories themselves made up? How can we even know if they're true? Are they just fabricated nonsense and so mean nothing? Well, to answer this question, we can look at a few more historical pieces of evidence. Firstly, asking the who kind of questions. Who were the people who gave the stories to the writers? Were they just gossips, passing things down from the centuries, or were they eyewitnesses? I think it's amazing how often people can be misquoted on the internet. I love finding sites like this where quotes have been misattributed to other people. Twitter is notorious for this kind of offence. The 140 character limit means that people drop quotations, shorten things, switch phrases around, so people end up saying things that they never did in the first place. I remember when Nelson Mandela died recently, and all sorts of people were tweeting and retweeting such inspirational things that the man had never said in his entire life. Is that the kind of thing we're getting with the Gospels? Are people putting words in the mouths of Jesus and his followers that never really happened? Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, calls the Bible a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors and copyists. Is this what we have? Well, again, there are reasons to suggest that this isn't necessarily as clear as we might think. The writers of the accounts of Jesus' life claim themselves that the stories came from eyewitnesses. Again, if you go back to Luke and how he begins his story, he talks about, looks like I've lost that slide, but he talks about the stories coming from eyewitnesses themselves, that he's carefully analysed and put together these sources based on the testimony of eyewitnesses. But do we just take their word for it? That this story really did come from eyewitnesses and not religious zealots with an axe to grind, or critics with a programme to stick to? I remember when I was at school, there was a boy in my class who would often claim that his dad played sport professionally for England. That sport would change from football to rugby to cricket depending on what day of the week he was telling the story. Obviously, he wasn't telling the truth. I knew his dad and he didn't look like in any condition to play any kind of sport professionally. But do we just have to take these people's word for it? No, we don't. We need to look at other sources and test them out as well. And this is what we can do with the Bible. A guy called Josephus, he was a Jewish historian, and he confirms a lot of the details that the eyewitnesses report in the Gospels. He talks about Jesus being a wise man who performed miraculous feats. He says that he won over many of the Jews and Greeks, and that Pilate condemned him to be crucified. This was a man who was not a Christian, and in many ways hostile to the Christian message, and yet he can still confirm the key facts that the eyewitnesses report. Even hostiles verify what they say. But we can also verify the eyewitness testimony, not just by looking at who and what and when, but by asking the where kind of questions. It's commonly understood that the writers of the Gospels didn't write them in the same area that Jesus lived and operated in. They wrote them elsewhere. And yet the accounts of Jesus' life contain all sorts of references to local areas and places that must have come from these eyewitnesses. From rivers and pools, to buildings, to language, to mountains and architecture. The writers of the Gospels are painting a very particular and distinct geographical picture of the area. And yet if they were not in them when they wrote them down, they must surely be relying on the stories from somewhere else. If the geographical details are vague or incorrect, it doesn't give us much reason to suggest that the eyewitnesses who are telling the story know it at all. They may be mistaken or lying through their teeth. But if the geographical details are good, then maybe we could think that they're not so mistaken after all. Perhaps there is a reason to trust their accounts. And this is where something like archaeology comes into its own. Now, it might not be something like Indiana Jones, but I still think it's pretty exciting. Recent archaeology has shown just how accurate some of the stories of Jesus are. Up until the 19th century, many scholars doubted the truth of John's Gospel because of one account about Jesus healing somebody at a place called the Pool of Bethesda. John described Bethesda in a particular way, saying it had 5 columns, and naming it and locating it. And scholars doubted that this was true because they'd never heard of a Pool of Bethesda before. And never heard of any pool in Jerusalem looking like the one that John described. It seemed completely nonsensical, and so they threw out the story of John's Gospel completely. Well, that was until the end of the 19th century when archaeologists discovered something that made them think again. They discovered a pool in exactly the place that John said it would be, and the details, all the 5 columns and everything that he described it to be, was accurate. And so when they finally verified it in the 1930s, scholars had to admit that John was right when he described the pool in this way. The geography was exactly as the eyewitnesses said it would be. And remember, this was even before Wikipedia, so it wouldn't be easy to fake something like this. So either the writers like John and like Luke and the others were able to guess at intricate geographical features of places they had never been to, or they were relying on not just eyewitness testimony, but good quality eyewitness testimony. See, these pieces of evidence, these what, where, who and when questions, I think they begin to call into question the idea that the eyewitnesses were mistaken in their reports and that the text had been changed over time. 2 big criticisms that the Bible faces. Now, it's not total proof, but enough to raise questions about our skepticisms. Enough to cause us to investigate Jesus further throughout this week. Maybe taking the Bible more seriously than we would have done otherwise. But one question remains. And I think it's probably the most important question of the lot. Why on earth did these people pass down stories about Jesus and then write them down to be shared with people later? Well, the most popular answer that we might get today from skeptics about the Bible is it's just propaganda. In the last 2,000 years, the church has grown remarkably strong and powerful and wealthy simply because people told this story, passed it on, and retold it again. Who's to say they didn't just do it for their own sake, for their own power, and for their own needs? Well, a very quick glance at history should be enough to dispel this idea. Life wasn't exactly great for the people who shared Jesus' story around. Persecution was violent, and most of Jesus' followers were executed for their beliefs. When I was a child, I confessed that I would often tell stories and tell lies to get myself out of trouble. I'd say things like, he started it, or but Dad said I was allowed to, or it was on fire when I got here. But I would never, and have never, told a lie to get myself into trouble. I wonder if you've ever done that. I don't think people do. We don't lie to get ourselves into trouble, and we certainly don't lie if we're going to be killed for it. You might die for something you believe is true, but no one dies for something that they know isn't true. And yet, that's exactly what Jesus' followers did. So there was no obvious political, social, or financial reason for people to fabricate the stories of Jesus. And there was every reason for lies to be exposed by the enemies of him. But that's not what happened. So we might suggest that they lied, but there's really no evidence to suggest that they did or why they would have done. You know, we don't have to be a detective to work out why the writers of the Gospels wrote what they did, because they tell us themselves. Luke says that he wrote it down so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. And John writes that these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. They were telling this story because they wanted people to know about Jesus, a man who had transformed their lives and promised something wonderful. And they wanted to tell people about it. You see, the Bible and the stories of the life of Jesus are like a window. We don't just look at them, but we look through them, looking through them to Jesus. So if you can suggest that the Bible is more historically reliable than maybe you thought when you came in this room, it's good reason to come back to some of the talks that are happening later this week and see if Jesus himself is more trustworthy than you might have given him credit for. Now, the evidence for the historical reliability of the Bible isn't an open and shut case, I confess. There's so much more that can be said, and probably lots of questions that have been raised, so do continue to text them into the number on the screen. But hopefully we've been able to see that some of our biggest objections are unfounded when we look at the real evidence of the Bible. So in a second we're going to break for questions. But while you're writing questions, maybe texting them in, do take a look at the books that are on your tables, the Uncover books, and feel free to take them away. They're a gift from the Christian Union to you, and they are a source document about the life of Jesus that we'd love you to take away and read. And on the feedback forms, you'll see that there's a box that says read more about it. And if you wanted to look at the Uncover books in more detail, and to maybe read them through the group and ask questions, then tick that box and we can arrange that for you. That'd be great. But why don't we go over to questions now?
Okay, first question. Shall I go over here? That's not easier. What about the books that the Catholic Church have suppressed, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. There have been, throughout history, lots of works about the life of Jesus that we might call Gospels, and the Gospel of Thomas is one example. And again, this is a great question looking at historical reliability. We said earlier that the stories of the life of Jesus we know were written within a generation or so of his life and death, by at least the end of the first century. And when we compare that to some of the other Gospels, or Gnostic Gospels as they're called, we find that they are nowhere near as historically reliable as the accounts of the life of Jesus that you find in the Bible. These other accounts are written much later, not based on eyewitness evidence, and paint a very different picture of the life of Jesus to the one that we find in the Bible themselves. So it's not a question of the Catholic Church or any church disregarding it because it's unfortunate, because it's not helpful and not part of the story they want to tell. But it's been disregarded and shown to not be as historically reliable as the other accounts of Jesus' life.
Okay, does anyone want to come back on that? Okay, we'll move on. saying that the stories about Jesus were written within one generation is all well and good, but how can you know that other books like Genesis or Leviticus are reliable?
Yeah, brilliant. Great question. So you notice that throughout the talk I was focusing particularly on the stories of the life of Jesus, and there's a reason for that. Not because we don't have reasons to suggest that the rest of the Bible is true, but because in 20 minutes we've only got a very short amount of time to deal with a big topic. And the stories of the life of Jesus are really important because Jesus is the central figure of all of Christianity, and if we can show that, maybe show that he wasn't who he said he was, then it all falls down like a pack of cards. But if he is who he said he was, then it means we need to take him and what he says very seriously, and it has huge implications for us. So that's why we focus on those particular books. Yeah, you can ask many questions about the historical reliability of the Old Testament too. And the thing about history, and particularly ancient history, is the further back you go in time, typically the less evidence that you'll have to be able to back things up, particularly archaeological evidence or evidence from other historical sources. So the Old Testament is harder to verify historically than the New, but that doesn't mean we can't say anything about it. If you were to take the train down to London and go to the British Museum there, you can walk around and see many artefacts that talk about people who are mentioned later on in the Old Testament, many figures and many stories there that are corroborated. You can see archaeological artefacts for that itself. This again proves more difficult as we go further back in time to maybe the time of King David and King Solomon, but there is still evidence to suggest the existence of King David himself. But the questions about Genesis and Leviticus and the first 5 books of the Bible, the questions that many scholars argue is that they were written much later as a kind of revision of the history of Israel. That they were writing something much later to kind of justify their existence, and so fabricated these stories thousands of years down the line. And there's good scholarship to suggest that this isn't actually necessarily the case. And you can read the texts and see that there are pointers in the way that the texts were written and the style of the text and the way that the stories are shaped, which point to them being of a particular historical period, much earlier than the one that critical scholars claim that they are. I could talk about that for ages, but I can already see eyes glazing over. If that is your question and you want to come and talk to me afterwards, then please do. I'd love to chat some more.
Yeah, and Gareth is going to be Tom's going to be sticking around. Gareth's going to be sticking around as well. You can talk to Gareth. But yeah, Tom's going to be sticking around afterwards, after this, with any more questions. But we'll just one more. But what about the miracles you mentioned? How can that actually be true? We don't see things like that today. Why not? If they are real.
Brilliant. Okay, what about the miracles in the Bible? Surely that indicates that they can't be historically reliable. So yesterday we were thinking about whether science contradicts Christianity, whether science contradicts the idea of a creator God. And Michael was talking about that. So I don't want to repeat a load of things he was saying about science. I suppose one thing I would say is your rejection of the existence of miracles and the possibility of miracles based on the historical evidence for them? Are you not convinced that there is sufficient historical evidence? Or is it based on an assumption you have about how the world works? If it's based on an assumption, then I think we do need to take the historical evidence seriously. Miracles, by definition, are not repeated phenomena. They happen once, so you can't stick them in a test tube and analyse them scientifically. You have to look at the historical evidence. And there is good reason to suggest that the historical evidence for miracles in particular is significant. The stories of the life of Jesus, we have 4 of them in the Bible, but they come largely from 5 sets of independent sources. Sources that were written separately from each other. And each of these 5 sets attest to a range of about 30 or so miracles. Not just the test of the number of them, but also a range and variety of the different types of miracles that Jesus performed. So there are significant sources, independent sources in the Bible that testify that these miracles happened. But you can also look to non-Christian sources. So we looked at Josephus. He talks about Jesus performing miraculous feats, performing miracles. He wasn't a believer. He didn't think that Jesus was the Son of God. But he doesn't question the fact of these miracles, but he questions the motivation and the implication of these miracles. Similarly with later Jewish writings like the Talmud say that Jesus was executed for sorcery, for practicing magic or miracles. They don't doubt the historicity of these events. They question why he did them. So I don't think the existence of miracles should be enough to dismiss the Bible completely, but maybe we should question what are they pointing to, what are they all about.
What about the discrepancies between Gospels? Different things happening or being said in each account even though they're supposed to be the same story.
Yeah, great, thank you. What about the discrepancies between the Gospels? Firstly, I would say that, as I said before, that the Gospels are made up of a collection of independent sources. And I suppose that's what happens, isn't it? When you get different perspectives on the same story, you'll often get slightly different accounts. If in a court of law, for example, if you're interviewing lots of different witnesses and they say word for word exactly what the other person has said, you start to think that maybe they're not telling the truth and maybe they've prepared it in advance. If by and large the facts agree and maybe their interpretations or the way they phrase things is slightly different, then that gives you reason to suggest that these are true accounts and just different perspectives and emphases in different places. And I think that's what we get with the Gospels, where by and large, and in numerous places, where the stories happen in different sources, the key events, the chronology, and largely the details match up. And it's the perspectives and the way in which they're talked about and phrased that is often slightly different, because they were written for different audiences, each of the Gospels, and different purposes as well. So yeah, I would suggest that if they were word for word exactly the same, we'd be asking the question, well, weren't they just made up? Is this one big conspiracy? The fact that there are slight kind of discrepancies in the way they're told gives good evidence to suggest that the sources that the writers were using were independent.